We're talking about both eminence and transcendence, sort of how can I both transcend and be present and be eminent. And sometimes we talk about the 4 different moves in evolution, and horizontally we talk about agency and communion, and then vertically there's Eros and Agapé. And Eros is always reaching up for higher unions, and Agapé is reaching down and embracing. So Eros is transcending and Agapé is including. So it's transcend and include. And then agency is the relative autonomy that every entity has at every stage of growth. And communion is the necessary relationship that all agents are in at every stage. And you can get something basically go wrong with either one of those. And you do get a kind of pathology, a kind of dysfunction when that happens. And so, and it does tend to be the case, so we can talk about this a little bit separately, that men and women tend to line up a little bit differently on these things. Men tend to have a little bit more eros, a little bit more agency, and women a little more agape, a little bit more communion. So and that just means the masculine and feminine principle in any of us. But that is important when you're doing therapeutic relationship, because sometimes what a man needs is to be more in touch with communion, and a woman needs to be more in touch with her autonomy, that kind of thing. And, you all are very familiar, you've played this out many, many times. But the transcendence eminence is what's really extraordinary, because it is, again, that paradox. You have to, in a sense, be able to stand back from it, but also embrace it. And if you do one or the other, you get in trouble. And so if you're merely embracing something, then it's all, you're attached, you're almost addicted, you're in fusion with it. You can't let go of it. And that has its own problems. If you're, on the other hand, merely transcending, then you can be very dissociative. And that's also a very, very, it's a very common problem. A little bit more, men have it a little bit more, but it can strike everybody. And so it's always this balance. And again, it's that same strange phase-specific phenomena, where first you have to really identify with something and embrace it, and then you're allowed to let go of it. You're not allowed to short-circuit that process. And part of the problem when some of the transcendental techniques came in is that people used it to bypass the embrace part. And so it had a very hyper-masculine, straight for the sky, I don't need to do any of this stuff, I don't have to touch any of this stuff. And so you get these, spiritual erections going straight up into the heavens, yeah. Part of my favorite day, actually, but that's my own, that's between me and my therapist. No, that's occupational hazard of the Y chromosome is, I'm out of here. You can actually look at the detailed, if we use in transformations of consciousness, we sort of took just 9 major levels of development. Again, you can subdivide development almost any number of ways, literally thousands of ways to do it. But we used 9 major ones and talked about the pathologies that can occur at each of those. And it's the same kind of thing, whether we use 7 chakras or 9 or 20. Development, starting in infancy, is you move up to a particular stage and you really have to identify with that stage. You have to digest it. You have to make it your own. It has to actually become part of you. So if you're at the oral stage, I'll just use some of the simple analytic terms, that means that you have to come to terms with food. And it means that you have to actually make a part of it, and you do it, and that's it. And all of a sudden your whole world is food for a while, and that's wonderful, and you're at your mother's breast, and it's fantastic. Sooner or later, though, other higher impulses start to emerge for many people. And they... two ways that can go wrong. One is you can repress that oral impulse, seal it off. The other is you can remain fixated to it in fusion. And that's true at every stage. So if it all goes healthy, you let go of it because you've already had an eminence. You've already had an agape. You've already embraced it. And therefore you can move up with Eros, transcend it, and include it in an ideal world. And then you get to the next stage. And there, in this case, let's say since we're using sort of Freudian, oral, anal, next phase, just let's call it genital in general. And there are erotic impulses starting to emerge. And for young boys and young girls, there are certain early erotic feelings that can emerge. They often are, sooner or later, addressed to the parent of the opposite sex, because that's what the biological drive is. And so if you're a young girl, you can start to have erotic feelings towards dad, and young boy towards mom. And so if you're a young girl and your erotic choices are towards dad, then you know that the book that's out now, it's like, there are many of these, Smart Women, Foolish Choices. You know that? Well, that's the first foolish choice the smart woman makes. She chooses a partner she can't have. And the same thing the young boy does. And that's the whole Oedipal Electra drama and so on that's been way overblown by the Freudians. But there's a little grain of truth to that. You're starting to awaken to erotic feelings. And of course there are men and women in the environment, and there are certain attractions going on there. And again, those impulses, if there's a safety about it, if it's embraced, if there's an okayness with it, that's fine, and you can actually have an eminence to it. And then you can let go and move on. But you can get in trouble in one of two ways, again, generically. You can remain fixated to it. You won't let go of it. And we all know sooner or later that that's going to come back and haunt you. And many, many therapeutic endeavors, particularly for those of you who work with depth psychology, are, okay, let's go back. You know, it's a cliche now. Let's talk about your mother. Let's talk about your dad. But so many of those feelings start way back then. And if you haven't inhabited them fully and healthily, then you're either going to repress them or you're going to remain stuck to them. And because of that, you've split it off. Those parts of subjective consciousness, little I's, remain sealed off as little subpersonalities that want the same thing they wanted when they were 2 years old or 3 years old or whatever it is. And they won't appear now in their true form in consciousness. They appear as an it. They're alien. And now it's a symptom. Oh, the anxiety, it affects me. I don't know what it is. And all of a sudden you're not assuming responsibility for it anymore. It's been split off. Many of you know that Freud's original phrasing for ego and id, he never ever used the term ego or id. You can find that in none of Freud's writings. The ego and the id are Latin terms that James Strachey used translating Freud's German into English. Freud used pronouns, and I think this is really extraordinary. He used the I and the it. That was what he wrote. So there's only one book in English, The Problem of Lay Analysis, where you can actually read Freud the way he wrote. And so instead of saying things like, the ego is overpowered by an id impulse, whatever the fuck that means, his actual language is, the I feels overpowered by an it that's stronger. So I say, it overcame me. The desire to eat, it was stronger than I could do it. And now his summary for therapy, very famous phrase, where it was, their ego shall be. What he actually said was, where it was, their I shall become. So it's taking the it back into an I. So I can see I'm doing it. It's my impulse that I split off and turned into an alien object, it. Then it attacks me as a symptom, and I have no idea where it came from. So it's my left hand not knowing what my right hand is doing. So that's the way that's eminence and transcendence. In other words, it's a broken form of it. Because it wasn't inhabited, it was split off and dissociated. So then you move to the next stage, and you've got a couple of these little subpersonalities or symptoms, however you want to call them, split off. And they're little bitty I's. They're little bitty intentionalities. They're little bits of subjective consciousness that want what they want when they were split off at that age. They literally retain the same value structure, the same desire. And again, go home for Christmas, give it a try. So we deal with this. So that's eminence and transcendence. So what we have here is both Agapé and Eros are not quite working out the way they should. So as you continue to grow, most people remarkably do fairly well. And we get, and again, I'll sort of make this part up. Let's say you have 100 pesos of consciousness when you start out. And you get through the first chakra, and 2 pesos get split off as an oral fixation. Okay, and now you got 98 pesos, and you get up to the second stage, and you got a horrible father figure, and 7 pesos get split off to that. And now you're sort of limping into stage 3, 89 pesos. By the time you get to adolescence, you've got about 68 pesos left. And unfortunately, it takes 72 for enlightenment. Oh darn. So that's where you have to go back and go, I want more money in my bank. That's what therapy is about. If the depth part of therapy, and we'll talk about, there are lots of other kinds, but the depth part is going back and reclaiming those portions of consciousness that were split off, denied, alienated, all displaced, all of the hierarchy of defenses that are designed to let you convert an I into an it and no longer own it. And so under those circumstances, in a sense what therapy is taking those that are split off and bringing eminence back to them. In other words, agape. I have to go back and re-love those portions. I have to befriend those portions. I have to take them back. I have to touch them with some sort of acceptance and care. And once I do that, I can let go of them. It's that phase-specific thing. So once I have agape and embrace it, then I can let go with Eros and move up. And guess what? It's moving up with me then. You've actually released the 3-year-old. And it can then rise up to wherever you are at that moment, which for most of us is at least 7 or 8 years old. So, yeah, a good day, yeah. But so it is that, and it's a very interesting thing. Once you introduce a vertical dimension, you get that phase specificity of you have to identify, then disidentify. Then identify with the next higher stage, then disidentify. Then identify, then disidentify. And it can get very confusing because some people want to just go in and just identify. And that often ends up being very regressive. And others want to just disidentify. I'm witnessing, I'm doing vipassana, and they just dissociate. And that's not good. So it's agape and eros, eminence and transcendence. And then both of those. And part of, I think, people that make really intuitively good therapists are ones that know when a person needs to touch something and when they need to let go of it. And you can just feel it sometimes. You can go, wait a minute, you really need to get in touch with that anger. And other times you say, okay, you know what? I've heard it. You've been angry for 3 weeks. Stop it. And you can just get that sense of when they've had enough and when they haven't had enough. And then right as you go on up the whole sort of frontal personality, there's the final kind of even witness itself. And that you have to inhabit that, and then you have to let go of it for big mind, big heart, non-dual, one taste. And it's the same thing. You can get stuck on either side of that. You can remain just merely distancing, witnessing. And that's not really quite right. Nor do you want to merely identify with passing phenomena. And so even in the higher reaches of spiritual practice, there's this extraordinary dialectic of eros and agape. Letting go of and embracing. And if you want to think about sort of the ultimate one taste, it really is transcending everything.